Years ago, Shadow was a symbol of strength and vitality. But life, as it so often does, threw him into a storm of hardship. He faced abandonment, cruelty, and a darkness far deeper than the blindness that now clouds his eyes. Through it all, Shadow endured, carrying with him the echoes of a bond long forgotten. But today is different. Today, the shadows of his past will meet the light of a memory he has carried for years. A voice, familiar and warm, is about to call out to him, a voice he hasn't heard in over 15 years. What happens when time and distance try to erase what the heart remembers? Can a horse, robbed of sight and surrounded by silence, recognize the voice of a friend from long ago? Stay with us as we uncover a story that will remind us all, some bonds are unbreakable, even in the face of time and loss. 15 years ago, Shadow wasn't just a horse, he was a companion, a confidant, and a friend. Back then, his world was filled with joy, the sound of laughter, and the gentle touch of a boy who loved him unconditionally. They were inseparable, a duo bound by trust and adventure. Together, they raced through endless fields, their spirits as free as the wind that brushed against them. Shadow's hooves thundered across the earth, and the boy's voice carried on the breeze, gentle words of encouragement, whispered promises of forever. But life, as it often does, intervened. Challenges that neither could foresee began to close in. A family's struggles. A decision made out of necessity, not choice. And in the quiet shadow of one heartbreaking afternoon, they were torn apart. The boy, tears streaking his cheeks, held Shadow's reins one last time. "I'll come back for you," he promised, his voice shaking with the weight of words he wasn't sure he could keep. Shadow nuzzled against him as if he understood, as if he could feel the sorrow radiating from the boy's heart. And then, they were no longer a pair. Shadow watched as his boy walked away, his figure disappearing over the horizon. The sound of his retreating footsteps was the last tether to the life they'd shared. But in Shadow's heart, the boy remained. The sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch, and the bond they'd forged never faded, no matter how many years passed or how much hardship Shadow faced. Now, after 15 long years, that memory is about to come to life. Will Shadow remember the boy who promised to return? And will the boy's promise finally be fulfilled? Stay with us as we journey into a story that spans time, distance, and the enduring power of love. 15 years is a lifetime for some. Memories fade, faces blur, and the echoes of familiar voices grow faint. But sometimes, just sometimes, bonds are so strong that even time cannot break them. Shadow's life has been anything but kind. The years have taken much from him, his sight, his freedom, and the warmth of the boy who once held his reins with such love. Yet, deep within him, something remains. A flicker of recognition, a distant feeling, like the faint scent of rain carried on the wind before the first drop falls. And now, after all this time, Shadow stands at the edge of a moment that could change everything. His ears flick at the faintest sounds, his nostrils flare, searching the air. Somewhere nearby, steps are being taken, steps that carry with them the weight of a promise made long ago. Could it be? Could a blind horse, separated by years of hardship and silence, truly recognize the voice of a friend from so long ago? Could the memory of that bond survive the trials of time, distance, and loss? We've seen stories of loyalty before, but this one is different. Shadow has lived in darkness, surrounded by silence, with nothing but the faint hope of something better. And now, that hope is about to be tested. Stay with us to witness what could only be described as a reunion like no other, a story that will remind us all of the extraordinary power of love, resilience, and the memories that define us. From the very moment Shadow entered this world, a fragile, wobbly foal with bright, curious eyes, the boy knew this horse was destined to be something extraordinary. Born under the soft glow of a summer moon, Shadow's arrival felt like magic, and the boy, standing in awe, made a silent promise: they would face life together, no matter what it brought. The boy spent endless hours by Shadow's side, whispering words of encouragement as the young horse took his first trembling steps. When Shadow stumbled, the boy was there to steady him. When Shadow nuzzled against him, searching for comfort, the boy answered with soft pats and gentle smiles. As they grew, so did their bond. The boy, full of boundless energy and wild dreams, found his perfect companion in Shadow, a creature who seemed to share his spirit of adventure. Together, they roamed endless meadows, their laughter and hoofbeats echoing across the hills. Shadow was fast, his legs strong and unyielding, his movements fluid as though the earth itself welcomed his touch. And the boy? He was fearless, trusting Shadow completely as they raced through forests, leaped over streams, and explored the unknown corners of their little world. Their bond was unspoken but unmistakable. In moments of triumph, like Shadow mastering a tricky jump or the boy acing a test at school, they celebrated together, joy radiating between them in a way that needed no words. And in times of struggle, when the boy's world felt too heavy or when Shadow fell ill, they found solace in each other's presence, a quiet understanding passing between them. The boy's family often marveled at the connection they shared. "He's more than just a horse," they'd say. "He's his other half." And perhaps they were right. Shadow wasn't just an animal, he was a friend, a confidant, and a reflection of the boy's own heart. But their days weren't just filled with grand adventures and joyous laughter. There were quieter moments too, afternoons spent lying in the shade of an old oak tree, the boy reading aloud while Shadow grazed nearby. Evenings when the boy would sit by the stable, his fingers brushing through Shadow's mane as he spoke of his dreams for the future. Dreams that always included Shadow by his side. To the boy, Shadow wasn't just a companion, he was a symbol of everything good and pure in the world. And to Shadow, the boy wasn't just a caretaker, he was his world. A pair that seemed invincible, their days were woven together like threads in a tapestry, each moment strengthening the fabric of their bond. But as the saying goes, even the brightest summers have their sunsets. The winds of change were beginning to blow, and neither the boy nor Shadow could foresee what lay ahead. For now, though, they had each other, and in their hearts, that was enough. They didn't know it yet, but the bond they were building during those years of joy and triumph would be tested in ways neither could imagine. And it would be this bond, unshakable, irreplaceable, that would carry them through the trials to come. They say life is unpredictable, and even the strongest bonds can be tested by its cruel twists. For the boy and Shadow, the idyllic world they shared began to crumble under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. The boy's family, once thriving, faced struggles that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Bills piled up, crops failed, and the laughter that used to fill their home was replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances. The boy, though young, understood more than he let on. He saw the pain in his parents' eyes and heard the weight in their voices when they spoke of sacrifices. But he never imagined Shadow would be one of them. The day the decision was made felt like a storm rolling in without warning. The boy overheard his father's voice, low and heavy, talking about how they couldn't afford to keep the horse anymore. Shadow, his closest companion, was to be sold to ease the family's burden. The boy's heart sank, a sharp pain settling in his chest. He couldn't believe it. Shadow wasn't just a horse, he was family, his partner in every adventure, the one who understood him in ways no one else could. How could they let him go? The next morning, the boy woke earlier than usual. The air felt colder, the sunlight dimmer. He ran to the stable, where Shadow greeted him with a soft nicker, unaware of what was about to happen. The boy buried his face in Shadow's mane, his tears soaking into the horse's coat. "I'll fix this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't let them take you. I promise, Shadow. I'll come back for you." But promises, no matter how heartfelt, can't always change reality. By midday, a truck arrived. The boy stood frozen as a man climbed out, his weathered face devoid of emotion. The man spoke to the boy's father, handing over a small stack of bills, money that was desperately needed but felt like a betrayal. The boy clung to Shadow's reins, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged. "Don't take him." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The man took the reins from the boy's trembling hands, leading Shadow toward the truck. Shadow resisted at first, his ears flicking back toward the boy as if he could sense his distress. But with a firm tug, he was guided away. The boy ran after them, his heart pounding, his legs weak. He called out Shadow's name again and again, his voice cracking with desperation. Shadow turned his head, his wide, trusting eyes meeting the boy's one last time. As the truck's engine roared to life, the boy's world shattered. He stood on the dirt road, his fists clenched, watching as Shadow was driven away. The dust settled, and the silence that followed was deafening. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's grief didn't fade. He spent hours at the fence line, staring into the distance, hoping for a glimpse of his friend. At night, he lay awake, replaying memories of their time together, clinging to the hope that one day he'd make good on his promise. "I'll come back for you," he whispered to the darkness. "No matter how long it takes." But life, with all its challenges, doesn't wait for promises. The years ahead would pull the boy in directions he never anticipated. And Shadow, far from the boy who loved him, would face his own trials. Yet, somewhere in their hearts, they both carried a spark, a memory of what once was and the faint hope that one day, somehow, they would find each other again. For Shadow, the journey after that fateful day was filled with challenges he never could have imagined. The truck that carried him away from the boy was not just a vehicle, it was a doorway to a life far removed from the warmth and love he had once known. At first, Shadow found himself in unfamiliar surroundings. A noisy, crowded farm where he was one of many, his once special bond with a human now replaced by cold, impersonal interactions. Days turned into weeks, and though his new caretakers ensured he was fed and housed, there was no affection, no gentle touch, and no reassuring voice to calm his restless heart. He tried to adapt, to find his place in this new world, but Shadow couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. At night, as he stood in the dimly lit stables, his thoughts seemed to drift back to the boy, the one who had promised to return, the one whose laughter had once been his guiding light. But life, as it often does, grew harsher with time. Shadow's strong, healthy frame began to weaken under the weight of neglect. He was sold again, this time to a smaller farm where resources were scarce, and care was a luxury. The proud, spirited horse who once ran freely through open fields and now carried heavy burdens, his body growing frail from the strain. And then came the illness. What began as a small discomfort turned into something far worse. Without proper attention, Shadow grew weaker by the day. His once shiny coat turned dull, and his eyes, once bright and full of life, began to lose their spark. The world around him blurred, the colors fading into shades of gray until there was nothing but darkness. Blindness took from Shadow the freedom he had once cherished. Every step became a risk, every sound a source of fear. He stumbled often, his legs trembling as he tried to navigate a world he could no longer see. But even in his most vulnerable moments, Shadow held on to something no illness or hardship could take away, the memory of the boy who had loved him. He remembered the gentle hands that brushed his coat, the voice that called his name with warmth and affection. He remembered the laughter, the trust, and the bond they had shared. These memories, faint as they were, became his anchor, pulling him through the darkness when everything else seemed lost. Shadow's life after separation was a testament to resilience. Though the years wore him down, they couldn't break his spirit entirely. He endured abandonment, illness, and blindness, yet he refused to give in. Somewhere deep within him, the echoes of his past kept him moving forward, one shaky step at a time. And now, standing in a quiet paddock far from the fields of his youth, Shadow remains a symbol of survival. His body is frail, his coat faded, but his heart still beats with the strength of the memories he has carried all these years. Memories of a boy who once promised to return. Shadow doesn't know it yet, but the darkness he has lived in for so long is about to lift. That boy, the one who was his whole world, is closer than Shadow could ever imagine. And soon, those long-forgotten echoes will become a reality once more. Because despite everything, Shadow never truly let go of the love that defined his life. And that love is about to find its way back to him. Years passed, and the boy grew into a man, his once carefree days of youth replaced by the responsibilities and challenges of adulthood. Life moved forward, as it does, but no matter how many steps he took, the memory of Shadow remained etched in his heart, a vivid reminder of a bond that time could not erase. He often found himself lost in thought, revisiting those sunlit days when Shadow was by his side. The memories were bittersweet, filled with the laughter they shared and the silent promises made in moments of quiet. But with those memories came a heavy weight, a lingering regret that gnawed at him as the years rolled on. I should have fought harder, he would think, the same words repeating in his mind like a mantra. I should never have let him go. The man had built a life for himself, but there were cracks in its foundation, places where the absence of his first and truest companion was felt most acutely. He would pass fields where horses grazed peacefully, and his heart would ache with the thought of Shadow. Was he safe? Was he cared for? Did he still remember the boy who had once been his entire world? Despite the passage of time, the man could never bring himself to truly move on. He kept small tokens of their time together, a faded photograph, an old halter that once fit snugly around Shadow's strong neck. These relics were tucked away, but not forgotten. On restless nights, when sleep evaded him, he would pull them out, running his fingers over the worn leather or gazing at the image of a younger version of himself, standing proudly beside his bright-eyed horse. And then there were the dreams. In the stillness of the night, Shadow would visit him, not as the frail and distant figure he feared Shadow might have become, but as the vibrant, powerful companion he remembered. They would gallop together through endless fields, the wind carrying their laughter. But when the man awoke, the reality of their separation hit him with the force of a wave, leaving him longing for the past. I promised I'd come back, he whispered to himself one morning, his voice heavy with determination. And I will. It's time. With that resolve, the man began his search. It wasn't an easy decision, life had its demands, responsibilities that couldn't be ignored, but the thought of Shadow, somewhere out there, kept pulling him forward. He scoured old records, tracking down every possible lead. He spoke to those who might know of Shadow's whereabouts, his questions laced with hope and fear. Have you seen a chestnut horse with a white blaze? He'd be older now, but strong, he was always so strong. Most leads turned into dead ends, but he refused to give up. Each step of the journey brought him closer, not just to Shadow, but to a part of himself that he had lost along the way. Shadow wasn't just a horse, he was a symbol of the man's youth, his first taste of unconditional love, and the promises he had made when life was simpler. Even as the search stretched on, the man felt a spark of hope he hadn't known in years. He didn't know what condition Shadow might be in, or even if he was still alive. But he couldn't let those doubts stop him. Somewhere deep within, he believed that their bond had survived, that Shadow was out there, waiting. The memory of my first companion never left me, he thought, a faint smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. And if there's even a chance that he remembers me too, I have to find him. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and obstacles. But for the man, it wasn't just about keeping a promise, it was about reclaiming a piece of his heart that had been missing for far too long. Shadow had been his guiding light once, and now, he was determined to find that light again. The search for Shadow was not just a journey across miles, it was a journey through time, memory, and hope. The man, now determined to fulfill the promise he made so many years ago, threw himself into the task with a singular focus. He had no guarantee of success, only the faintest whispers of possibility to guide him. His first step was the records. Sitting in the quiet corner of a small-town library, he sifted through pages and pages of old farm sales, auction listings, and transfer documents. Each faded line of ink told a story, some filled with promise, others with heartbreak. He searched for any mention of a chestnut horse sold on that fateful day, piecing together fragments of Shadow's journey like a detective following a trail. There has to be something here, he muttered to himself, his fingers tracing over names and dates. Hours turned into days as he pored over the details, his heart sinking with every dead end. But giving up was not an option. The man expanded his search, traveling to the farms and stables that once stood at the crossroads of Shadow's past. He approached strangers with photographs and questions, his voice tinged with both hope and urgency. Have you ever seen a horse like this? chestnut coat, a white blaze down his face. He would have been strong and fast back then. Most replies came with a shake of the head, polite but dismissive. Some didn't remember, others didn't care. The man's heart ached with each rejection, but he refused to let the disappointment deter him. Shadow deserved this effort, deserved to know that he hadn't been forgotten. At one stable, he found an older man, a retired handler who paused when he saw the photograph. "I think I remember a horse like that," he said, his brow furrowing. "He was sold again, not long after he came through here. Tough horse. Smart, too. But I can't say where he went." The information, though vague, was enough to rekindle the man's hope. He followed the thread, traveling to another sanctuary where he asked the same questions, showed the same photo, and shared the same story. And each time, the picture of Shadow's life became a little clearer, a series of moves from place to place, each one taking him further from the boy he had once known. The search wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the man questioned himself, moments when doubt crept in. "What if I'm too late?" he thought during one sleepless night. "What if Shadow's story ended long before I began searching?" But those thoughts were quickly pushed aside. He had come too far, invested too much to turn back now. One day, after weeks of searching, he found himself standing at the gates of a sprawling sanctuary nestled in a quiet valley. The air was still, the kind of stillness that carries with it a sense of gravity. Here, he was told, older and injured horses were given a chance to live out their remaining years in peace. "This is my last chance," he thought, his heart pounding. "If Shadow isn't here, I don't know where else to look." As he approached the sanctuary's caretaker, he felt a lump in his throat. He held out the photograph, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm looking for this horse," he said, his voice low but steady. "His name is Shadow. He would be older now, blind maybe, but I think he might be here." The caretaker studied the photograph for a long moment, their face unreadable. Then, with a faint nod, they gestured for him to follow. "We do have a horse like that," they said quietly. "But I need to warn you. He's not the same as he was. Life hasn't been easy for him." The man's heart raced as he followed the caretaker through the sanctuary. With every step, anticipation and fear battled within him. What if Shadow didn't remember him? What if the years had erased the bond they once shared? Finally, they reached a quiet paddock at the edge of the sanctuary. The caretaker pointed to a lone figure, a chestnut horse standing still, his head bowed low, his body marked by the passage of time. The man's breath caught in his throat. It was Shadow. He knew it instantly, not just from the blaze on his face, but from the way his presence stirred something deep within him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. "There you are," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I found you." But as he stood there, gazing at the horse that had been his world so long ago, one question lingered in his mind: would Shadow remember him too? As the man stood at the edge of the sanctuary, his heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. The journey had been long, the doubts many, but now, standing here, he felt an overwhelming mixture of anticipation and fear. This place, with its quiet paddocks and weathered fences, was his last hope. The caretaker led him through the sanctuary, their words kind but cautious. "We have a horse that matches your description," they said. "But you need to prepare yourself. He's not what he used to be. Life has been hard on him." The man nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. He didn't care what Shadow looked like now. Scars, frailty, even blindness, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that Shadow was here. And then, he saw him. At the far end of a quiet paddock, a lone horse stood motionless. His once vibrant chestnut coat was dull, his frame thin and frail. His head hung low, and his eyes, clouded and unseeing, gazed into a void only he could understand. But despite all of that, the man knew. "That's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's Shadow." The caretaker nodded but remained silent, giving the man space to process the moment. The man took a shaky step forward, his eyes never leaving the horse. Memories flooded his mind: Shadow galloping across open fields, the sound of his joyful whinnies, the warmth of his breath as they shared quiet moments together. But the shadow standing before him now was a shadow in every sense of the word. The years had taken their toll, and yet, as the man's gaze swept over him, he saw something that hadn't changed: a quiet strength, a resilience that no amount of hardship could erase. He moved closer, his steps hesitant, as if afraid to break the fragile stillness of the moment. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, his chest tightening as he tried to find the words. "Shadow," he said softly, the name catching in his throat. The horse didn't move at first. For a moment, it seemed as though the sound of his voice had been lost to the wind. But then, Shadow's ears flicked, just slightly, but enough to make the man's heart leap. "It's me," the man continued, his voice trembling. "Do you remember me?" Shadow raised his head slowly, his unseeing eyes searching for the source of the voice. He took a hesitant step forward, his movements cautious and unsteady, as though he were reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. The man extended his hand, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I promised I'd come back for you. And I'm here now." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world around them faded, and it was just the two of them, reunited after years of separation, pain, and longing. Shadow sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring as he caught the faint, familiar scent of the man. And then, slowly but surely, he took another step forward, his head lowering until it rested gently against the man's chest. The man let out a broken laugh, his hands shaking as he stroked Shadow's neck. "You do remember," he whispered. "You never forgot." Tears fell freely now, both from the man and from those watching nearby. It was a moment that defied logic, a moment that spoke to the power of love and memory. Could this fragile, blind horse truly be my shadow? The man had wondered as he stood at the edge of the paddock. Now, as he held his old friend, he knew the answer. Only time could tell how their story would unfold from here, but one thing was certain: the bond they had shared had never truly been broken. It had endured through years, distance, and hardship, waiting for this moment to be rekindled. And now, at long last, Shadow was home. The air seemed to hold its breath as the man stepped closer to the paddock. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the years and the memories they carried pressed down on him. Shadow stood still, his head slightly bowed, his posture one of quiet resignation. Yet, there was an air of dignity about him, a resilience that hadn't been lost despite all he had endured. The man stopped just short of the fence, his heart pounding so loudly that he thought it might drown out his voice. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the sight of the horse he had spent years searching for. His throat tightened as emotions threatened to overwhelm him: joy, regret, relief, and love all blending together. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "Shadow," he called, his voice soft but filled with unmistakable emotion. It was the same tone he had used all those years ago, a mix of affection and familiarity, as if the years between them had never existed. Shadow didn't react immediately. His ears twitched slightly, the faintest sign that he had heard the voice. But he remained still, his blind eyes fixed on nothingness. The man tried again, his voice trembling but steady. "It's me, boy. It's me." This time, Shadow shifted, his head lifting ever so slightly. His body tensed, as if some long-forgotten instinct was stirring within him. The man stepped closer, resting his hands on the top of the fence. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Do you remember my voice? The fields we ran through? The promises I made to you?" Shadow turned his head slightly toward the sound, his ears swiveling to catch every word. He took a hesitant step forward, his movements slow and cautious, as though he were unsure if what he was hearing could be real. The man's heart raced. "That's it, Shadow," he said encouragingly. "It's me. It's your boy." I'm here now, just like I promised. And then it happened. Shadow paused, his body still as though caught between two worlds, the life he had known and the one he had been forced to leave behind. For a moment, it seemed as though he might retreat, the weight of his past too great to overcome. But then, he took another step. And another. His head tilted slightly, his nose lifting to the air as he sniffed, searching for a scent that might confirm what his heart was already telling him. The man extended his hand, his palm open and trembling. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "It's okay. I'm here." Finally, Shadow closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches away, his head lowering as he leaned cautiously toward the man's outstretched hand. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent of the one person who had never truly left his heart. And then, as if time itself had folded back on itself, Shadow pressed his head gently into the man's chest. The man let out a shaky breath, his arms wrapping around the horse's neck as tears streamed down his face. "You remember," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You never forgot me." In that moment, the years melted away. The boy and the horse who had once been inseparable were together again, their bond rekindled as if it had never been broken. The hardships, the distance, the pain, all of it faded into the background, overshadowed by the unshakable connection that had brought them back to each other. The man stroked Shadow's neck, his fingers running over the scars that marked the horse's body. "I'm so sorry, Shadow," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything you went through. For all the time we lost. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Shadow let out a soft nicker, a sound so faint that it was almost inaudible. But to the man, it was everything, a sign that Shadow, despite all he had endured, still trusted him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the paddock, the man and Shadow stood together, their silhouettes framed by the fading light. For the first time in years, the man felt whole, as if a missing piece of his heart had been returned to him. And for Shadow, a life that had been filled with darkness and struggle was suddenly brightened by the presence of the one person who had never truly left him. This was more than a reunion, it was a testament to the enduring power of love, memory, and the promises that bind us to those we hold dear. And as they stood there, together once more, it was clear that this was only the beginning of their story. The moment was delicate, like a fragile thread reconnecting two souls that had been separated for far too long. As Shadow leaned into the man's touch, it was as if years of pain and uncertainty began to unravel, replaced by a quiet sense of recognition and safety. The man's hand trembled as it rested on Shadow's neck. His touch was gentle, hesitant, almost as if he feared that one wrong move might shatter the fragile bond they had just rediscovered. Shadow stood still, his body relaxed yet alert, as though he, too, was processing the emotions swirling around them. "I missed you, boy," the man whispered, his voice low and steady. "More than you could ever know." Shadow responded with a soft nicker, the sound almost imperceptible but enough to bring a fresh wave of tears to the man's eyes. Slowly, he began to run his fingers through Shadow's mane, the familiar texture bringing back memories of the countless times he had done this as a boy. The man crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Shadow's level. He spoke softly, his voice full of warmth and reassurance. "It's just us now, like it always was. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Shadow shifted slightly, his ears flicking back and forth as he listened to the man's voice. It was as if the words were sinking into him, unlocking memories buried beneath years of hardship. He nudged the man's shoulder gently, a small but profound gesture that spoke louder than words. The man couldn't help but smile through his tears. For so long, he had feared that Shadow might not remember him, that the years apart might have erased the bond they had once shared. But now, in this quiet moment, all of those fears seemed to melt away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered object, a piece of rope fashioned into a simple halter. "Do you remember this?" he asked, holding it up for Shadow to sniff. It was the halter Shadow had worn as a foal, a token the man had kept through all the years they'd been apart. Shadow's nostrils flared as he inhaled the faint scent of the halter. He let out a soft snort, his head dipping slightly as if in recognition. The man laughed, a sound filled with relief and joy. "I knew you'd remember," he said, his voice cracking. The moments that followed were a mixture of tears, smiles, and quiet reflection. The man sat down in the paddock, his back resting against the fence as Shadow stood beside him. They didn't need words to communicate, their shared presence was enough. The man reached out again, his hand finding its place on Shadow's shoulder. This time, there was no hesitation, just a deep, unspoken trust between them. Shadow leaned into the touch, his body relaxing completely for the first time in what felt like years. "You've been through so much," the man said softly, his voice filled with both sorrow and admiration. "But you never gave up. And neither did I." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the paddock, the two of them stood together, their silhouettes blending into the landscape. The man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day sink in. He thought of everything that had brought him here, the years of searching, the moments of doubt, and the promise he had made so long ago. And now, standing beside Shadow, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For Shadow, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter. The gentle touch of the man's hand, the sound of his voice, and the warmth of his presence were all reminders that he was no longer alone. He had found his way back to the one person who had always believed in him. Together, they had begun to rebuild the trust that had been the foundation of their bond all those years ago. And as the man gently stroked Shadow's neck, he knew that this was only the start of their journey, a journey of healing, love, and unshakable trust. Sometimes, life offers moments so profound, they seem to stand outside of time. This was one of those moments. As the man stood with Shadow, the bond they had shared so long ago wasn't just remembered, it was alive, tangible, and unbroken. Shadow shifted closer, his movements slow and deliberate. His unseeing eyes could no longer take in the world around him, but in his heart, he recognized what his senses could not. There was something familiar in the presence before him, the warmth, the scent, the soft cadence of a voice he had thought he'd never hear again. The man gently placed both hands on either side of Shadow's face, his palms cradling the once powerful head that now rested with quiet surrender. "You remember me, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question born of doubt, it was a statement of faith, an acknowledgement of the connection they had always shared. And then it happened. Shadow leaned forward, his head pressing firmly into the man's chest. It wasn't the hesitant gesture of before, it was purposeful, filled with trust, as if to say, "I know you. I've waited for you." The man's breath hitched, his arms wrapping around Shadow's neck as tears spilled freely down his face. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a miracle. Against all odds, Shadow had remembered. Despite the years of separation, the pain, and the countless hardships, their bond had survived. "You've always been my boy," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when we were apart, you were always with me." Shadow let out a soft, low nicker, a sound that carried with it years of unspoken words. It was a sound the man hadn't heard in over a decade, yet it was as familiar as the beating of his own heart. He laughed through his tears, his hand brushing gently over Shadow's mane. "That's my boy," he said, his voice filled with both joy and relief. For Shadow, this moment was more than just recognition, it was redemption. The years of darkness and struggle melted away as he stood with the man who had once been his entire world. In the warmth of the man's embrace, Shadow found something he had thought he'd lost forever: safety, love, and a sense of belonging. "You've been waiting for me all this time, haven't you?" the man asked, his voice soft and filled with awe. Shadow nudged his chest gently in response, as if to say, "I never gave up." The two stood there for what felt like hours, neither of them needing words to fill the silence. The sun, now low in the sky, cast a golden glow over the paddock, illuminating the tears in the man's eyes and the quiet strength in Shadow's posture. "Against all odds," the man said, his voice trembling, "you've shown me that some bonds are unbreakable, even by time." As the man stepped back slightly, he looked into Shadow's clouded eyes, his hand still resting on the horse's face. "I'll never leave you again," he promised. From now on, we face everything together. Shadow's ears flicked, his body relaxing fully for the first time in years. The scars on his coat, the stiffness in his legs, none of it mattered anymore. In this moment, he was no longer the horse who had endured years of hardship, he was Shadow, the boy's loyal companion, rediscovered and reborn. The man stroked his neck, his fingers tracing the lines of muscle that had once carried him through countless adventures. "We've both been through so much," he said softly, his eyes misting over. "But we're here now. That's all that matters." In the quiet of the paddock, surrounded by the whispers of the evening breeze, the man and Shadow began to rebuild what had never truly been lost. This heartwarming moment was a testament to the enduring power of love, a reminder that even in the face of time and adversity, some bonds cannot be broken. And as they stood there, side by side, it was clear that this wasn't just the end of a journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, healing, and the unshakable connection they had always shared. The journey back to the farm was quiet, filled with the kind of peace that comes after a storm. Shadow walked steadily beside the man, his steps guided by trust rather than sight. The truck that had once taken him away now served a different purpose, it was bringing him home. As they traveled the familiar winding roads, the man couldn't help but reflect on the memories etched into every bend and turn. This was the route he had walked so many times as a boy, with Shadow trotting happily at his side. Now, years later, they were retracing those steps, though much had changed. Shadow, despite his blindness, seemed to sense where they were headed. His ears flicked at the rustle of leaves, his nostrils flaring at the scents carried by the wind. It was as though the land itself was calling to him, whispering of the place where he had once belonged. When they arrived at the farm, the man led Shadow down the dirt path toward the old stable. His voice was soft but steady as he spoke, reassuring his companion with every step. "We're here, boy," he said, his hand resting gently on Shadow's neck. "We're finally home." Shadow paused at the entrance to the paddock, his head lifting as he inhaled deeply. Though his eyes could no longer see, his body seemed to relax, as if the very air carried memories of the past. The man smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's like you can feel it, isn't it? You know this is where you're meant to be." As they crossed the threshold, a sense of calm settled over them both. The farm, with its weathered fences and wide-open fields, had waited patiently for their return. And now, after years of separation, Shadow was finally where he belonged. The days that followed were a time of adjustment and quiet discovery. Shadow, still tentative in his movements, began to explore his old home under the careful guidance of the man. Each morning, the man would lead Shadow out to the fields, his voice serving as a gentle beacon. "One step at a time," he would say, his tone filled with encouragement. Shadow responded with cautious but steady steps, his trust in the man growing stronger with each passing day. The barn, once a place of comfort and familiarity, became Shadow's sanctuary again. The man made small modifications to help Shadow navigate, placing bells on the stable door and marking pathways with soft, textured mats. It wasn't just about making Shadow's life easier, it was about showing him that he was safe, that he was cared for. With every passing day, Shadow began to regain his strength. His coat, once dull and lifeless, started to shine again. The stiffness in his legs eased as he moved with newfound confidence. The man would often watch from a distance, a smile spreading across his face as he saw the horse he remembered slowly coming back to life. "You're stronger than ever, Shadow," he said one afternoon, watching as the horse trotted through the paddock, his movements steady and sure. "You've always been a fighter." Shadow's journey wasn't without its challenges, but he faced each one with quiet resilience, guided by the unwavering presence of the man who had never stopped believing in him. The bond between the man and Shadow deepened with each shared moment. Their days were filled with small victories and quiet joys, simple yet profound reminders of the connection that had always existed between them. The man often brought Shadow to the field where they used to run together. Though Shadow could no longer see the wide-open sky or the golden grass that swayed in the breeze, he could feel it, the warmth of the sun, the softness of the earth beneath his hooves. One day, the man stood beside Shadow, his hand resting on the horse's mane. "Do you remember this place?" he asked softly. Shadow let out a soft nicker, as if to say, "I do." Their moments together weren't just about reliving the past, they were about building a future. The man spent hours grooming Shadow, his hands working gently as he spoke of dreams they could still share. "We'll make new memories, boy," he said with a smile. "There's so much more for us to do." Shadow's confidence grew with every touch, every kind word. And with that confidence came a joy that neither of them had felt in years. The man laughed more often, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Shadow, too, seemed to carry himself differently, his steps were surer, his spirit brighter. "It wasn't just you who needed healing," the man admitted one evening as they stood together under the fading light of the day. "It was me too. You've given me back a part of myself I thought I'd lost." Shadow leaned his head against the man's shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth they both felt. This wasn't just about a horse finding his way home, it was about two souls, bound by love and memory, rediscovering the strength they had always given each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the farm, the man and Shadow stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. In that moment, it was clear, the journey they had begun so many years ago was far from over. It had simply entered a new chapter, one defined by trust, joy, and the unbreakable connection that time could never take away.